Hello, I'm very happy to welcome you to today's talk. My name is Caroline Haycock, and I'm speaking very briefly at this moment because I'm the president of the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, or LAGB, and we are very happy to have been invited to participate in collaboration in this series. And we have already, you've heard a wonderful range of speakers in this series. And we're very happy that some more wonderful speakers we've been able to invite from Great Britain to participate, including, but this is only some of the people who are going to be part of this, Jenny Culbertson, Adam Skembry, Rob Drummond, Margaret Ducher, and Anders Holmberg. But today, I'm very happy to say that Jane Setter of the University of Reading is going to be the speaker. To introduce her properly, I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Alves. So I'm sure we're going to have a wonderful session today, and I look forward to this and to many in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Haycock. Hello, everyone. I hope you're all fine. I'm Professor Alves from Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, and it is my pleasure to introduce this talk promoted by Abralin, the Brazilian Association of Linguistics. This is one of the many lectures and panels of Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online, and this event is organized with the cooperation of the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the Association of Linguistics and Philology of Latin America, the Argentinian Society of Linguistic Studies, the Linguistic Society of America, the European Linguistic Society, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, and the Australian Linguistic Society. It is an honor to introduce our guest. Professor Jane Setter is a Professor of Phonetics at the University of Reading and a National Teaching Fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. She has published widely on phonology in second language Englishes and emerging varieties, and among children with speech and language disorders. Professor Setter is a regular commentator in the British media on issues related to English pronunciation, speech features, and attitudes to accents, and appeared as an expert on programs. The title of Professor Setter's presentation is Your Voice Speaks Volumes. Why do we speak the way we do? And what do our voices tell others about us? What is the truth behind the myths that surround how we speak? Jane Setter explores these and other fascinating questions in this engaging introduction to the power and the science of the voice. I would like to invite you all to watch the lecture and write your comments in our chat box. I will then select some questions to be answered after the presentation. Professor Setter, it is a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you once again very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very glad to be here. I'm very glad to be invited both by Abralin and by the LAGB. So thank you so much for having me as a speaker. I'm going to talk about my recent book, basically because it brings together so many things that I'm fascinated about to do with speech and phonetics. And so I wanted to bring that to a wider audience, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to share my screen with you now, if I can get it to behave. Except I can't see you, so let's go back. Technical difficulties, let's see. Share it first, then we'll do that. Where are we? Share screen, okay. And I am here. Okay, so my talk is Your Voice Speaks Volumes, English Speech Matters. It's looking at issues to do with speech in English, and the book is specifically about English. I am going to see if it will animate for me. Yes, good. In this talk, I'm going to be saying something about accents and tribalism in English, British English in particular, accent prejudice, which is something that we find we get a lot in the UK, and I understand that you get it a lot in some other countries as well. Prejudice is because of the way people speak. I'm going to also look at how your voice can give you away, so a little bit about forensic speaker identification and comparison. I'm also going to talk about some differences to do with men and women's voices, how they're perceived and what those double standards are. Then something about considerations for English language teaching in an international context based on these things that I'm talking about. And finally, I'm just going to say something about writing a popular science book in case anyone's interested in doing this. I found it to be very rewarding and very interesting. So just to start with, from a very, very young age, in fact, from inside your mother's womb, you are picking up information about the speech of the language or languages that your mother speaks. There's been research that has shown that really early babies, newborn babies, neonates, are identifiable from their language patterns, that you can tell information about which language they belong to, which language speaker group they belong to, based on things like their intonation. Now, clearly, they're not going to be able to have adult-like language when they emerge from the womb. That's not something. But the brain is very much predisposed to picking up language patterns, picking up patterns of any kind. It looks for them. And what we know is that the ear is in a state of development by about 5 months inside the womb, where it's able to transmit sounds to the brain that the brain can start to process. And intonation is one of those things that you hear when you're inside your mother's womb. You can't hear much else. So you can hear things like this sort of stuff, depending on the language that you belong to. Of course, that's very British English sounding intonation. And when children are born, these sorts of patterns are already evident in neonates. It's really, really fascinating. So we're picking up our language patterns from a really, really early age. And something that we find is that these language patterns are things that develop, of course, over time. And when you emerge and start to be surrounded by the sounds of the language around you, you start to learn the patterns of those speakers, basically. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is accents and tribalism. What happens is that we are born into particular speaker groups, and these speaker groups will be separate and distinct from other speakers. And in some cultures, and definitely in England, we find this, people are judged very much by the patterns that they are showing because of the speaker groups that they belong to. So what we find is that we get something called accent prejudice. We get people making assumptions, having opinions about the way that you speak because of, well, just making assumptions about your background because of the way that you speak, basically. But it seems to be particularly something that we find in England and in Britain. Why might this be the case? Okay, I'm just going to give you an example. Every time this pops onto the screen, I have to say my mouth just waters. I just want one of these things. But if I present this in a class or at an open day where I'm talking to students or parents, prospective students, and so on, there will be differences in the way that people say this word. And there will be within family differences with the way people say this word. It's quite extraordinary. You see parents sitting next to children realizing that they actually say this word in a different way. And then there's an argument about it. There's always an argument about something to do with accents in British English. And here we go. This is one of those things that people argue about. So we either pronounce the word as rhyming with gone. That's actually rhyming with cone, sorry, the other way around, or as rhyming with gone. So we'll either say scone or we'll say scone. And this sort of thing splits families. Isn't it interesting that that would happen? Incidentally, these scones are produced by Dr. Hazel Price, who I know through the Babel committee. Babel is a language magazine. If you're interested, do ask me about it. So if we think about the distribution of this word, of the pronunciation of this word in Britain, what do we find? Now, you might think, well, why on earth would people be interested in this kind of thing? But actually we are. We're absolutely fascinated with it. And a number of people have done research where they've looked at differences in accents and dialects and tried to find out how people produce things, produce words with different accents in Britain. And a group of my colleagues at the University of Cambridge have produced a number of maps based on an application that they wrote to research this. So here we go. This map is showing you where people pronounce the word as scone and where they pronounce it as scone in Britain. And what we can see here is that if you are from an orange area, you are most likely to pronounce it as scone. If you are from a green area, and we've got Ireland here, which is not part of Great Britain, of course, but if you are from Ireland, you'll pronounce it as scone, you'll pronounce it to rhyme with cone. But we've also got some areas in England where people pronounce this to rhyme with cone as well. We've got them up here around the sort of north and northeast, Midlandsy sort of area, if you like, further north from that. And then we've got a bit here around the Essex area and around East London. In Ireland, there's quite a line. So if you're from the north, you'll say scone, and if you're from the south, you'll say scone. And we can see that if you're from Scotland largely, and from the north of Britain, and also from Wales, you're going to say scone, no question at all. But if we look at England, it's much more mixed. And now this bit down here always interests me. This is Cornwall and Devon. Cornwall and Devon have an argument about which way the jam and the cream goes on the scone. I actually say scone. Doesn't matter which one you say. It's not a matter of being correct. They're both possible variants. But if you are from Cornwall, you are more likely to say scone. And if you're from Devon, well, certainly the east part of Devon, you're more likely to say scone. This is just one of a number of words that researchers have looked at to look at the different patterns. And why would you say it in a different sort of way? What does it mean about you? Do people assume, for example, that it's more posh to say one and not the other? That's a possibility, but we have these differences. Now, I'm going to just give you some more data from two surveys of English that were looking at accents and dialects of the British Isles. One of them was done in the 1950s, 1960s, published in the 60s and 70s, and this was the Survey of English Dialects. It's a really well-known survey of English dialects. And I'm also going to look at some of the data that was collected by Adrian Lehmann's English Dialects app when he was working at the University of Cambridge originally. He's no longer there. He's now working on accents of, actually I think he's working on German accents and dialects using a similar kind of methodology. So we'll look at the data from some of these. Let's start with this map here. This is a 1950s map of the pronunciation of the word spelt A-R-M. Now, we tend to think of British English as being something called non-rhotic, which means we don't pronounce the R sound unless it is before a vowel, not after it. But we can see from this 1950s map that actually, if you are in the orange area, you are going to pronounce this as arm, arm. Now, I'm living in Hampshire at the moment, so I'm around here, and I actually grew up in Kent, so that's where I grew up on this bit here, but I was born after the 1950s. We can also see that if you are in the green area, you're going to say arm, which is the pronunciation that we most commonly associate with British English now, although again it will depend on where you're from. Certainly if you're from Scotland, you're not going to say arm because it's an English thing that we're looking at here. So that is the 1950s map. Here is the map from the recent up-to-date map, the 2016 one. And we can see here, if we look at England, that hardly anybody now is saying arm. Most people are saying arm, unless you are from the far southwest, down here in Cornwall, some areas of Devon, and also around Bristol. And then we've got a little bit here up between Liverpool and Manchester, where we're still getting some arm going on there. actually looking at these maps, it tells us a lot about things like history, it tells us about human geography, it tells us about technology and so on. So just by looking at accents, we're learning a lot about developments in a country, about how things move on, how they change. So what we can tell here is that between the 1950s and the 2016 sort of time, we're seeing differences in the way that people are using these sorts of words, using this speech feature. So they're not saying arm anymore if they're from the Southwest, they're saying arm largely. Why is this? Well, we know, for example, that there have been a lot of movements in things like transport. So now it's possible to travel by high-speed train all over the country. It's possible to travel by motorway all over the country as well. And that means that it's easier for people who are living outside of populous areas like London, for example, to commute into London and to work there and to mix more with people who have different sorts of accents. If accents are seen as prestige, and if you feel that you're more likely to get a job with a particular sort of accent and less likely to get a job with another sort of accent, then you may change the way that you speak for that reason. So we can see that there have been changes in history, but what I want to show you now is a map that takes us back a little bit in time. So this map here is a map of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in about 900 AD. And we can see in this map the Danelaw, which is the area that was occupied by the Danes, the Vikings basically, which is East Anglia. We've got the Yorkshire sort of area up here. We've got North Cumbria and so on. So we've got these sorts of areas in the east and northeast of the country. In the southwest, this was occupied by the Saxons, and we can see that we've got Mercia, so a large part of Mercia, West Mercia and South Mercia. We've also got Wessex, and then we've got Kent and Sussex. Interestingly, we've also got an area down here called West Wales. So this is Cornwall and Devon. And we've got this area up here that's just called Wales, and that is Wales. The word Wales actually comes from the Anglo-Saxon word to describe the native Britons. So the native Britons were pushed out by the Anglo-Saxons and by the Danes into Wales and into the far southwest. So we see that there are some accent differences because of those sorts of things, because of movement around, because of different settlement by different people during the time that this was taking place back in history. But if we compare that map with the 1950s map, we can actually see that they're very, very similar. We've got a road here on the map from about 900, and this is Watling Street. Watling Street is still there. There are bits of Watling Street all over Britain, where they were here on the map. Anyway, I'm not saying they suddenly sort of went up and walked away and went somewhere else, but there's Watling Street down in Kent, and it extends basically up to about Chester, that sort of area. And this was a very important line, and we can see that this line is still there in the 1950s map, this kind of Watling Street sort of map going on. So we've got this divide here. So the way that people were speaking in the 1950s, to a certain extent, if not a great extent, was already set by about 900, when people had settled in different areas, when different tribes had settled in different areas. Wessex, for example, eventually it had one king under King Alfred, but before that it was a number of fiefdoms with a number of different kings, and you would have been very loyal to your king, and your accent would have developed depending on where you were, and you just would not have moved around very much. So the only people that we see moving around a great deal are royalty, basically, people who are going around on progress, or people who are fighting. So if you're in armies, then you'll be moving around too. So we can actually get quite a lot of information about history by looking at people's accents, and by looking at language change and accent change, we can learn a lot about ourselves and about the way society is changing. Now, accents can imply a lot of different sorts of things. If you're listening to somebody speaking, then we tend to form opinions about people based on these accents. And we get this tribalism still coming through. So people who have accents from different areas of the country are often either discriminated against or are given some kind of prestige, for example, because of the way that they speak. Accents can be regional, as we've seen, but they can also be social. They can be occupational. They can be stylistic. They could be ethnically based, age-based, gender-based, sexuality-based. They can be based on another language that you have. So if English is your second language, then they can be L1 influenced by your first language. And when I ask the question, are there any other ways that accents can be described? There are lots. This is not the end of the line at all. But in England, what we find is that people tend to discriminate based on regional differences and social differences. And often we find that occupation is inferred, if you like, through the way that somebody speaks. There are a lot of misconceptions about L1 English accents. So one misconception is that they're always regionally based. This is not the case at all. Received pronunciation, one of the best known accents probably of British English, is not regionally based. It's a variety that's spoken all over the UK. Also that they're low or substandard varieties. No, there are high variety accents as well. Again, RP is an example of one of those. Also, there's an assumption that if you have an accent, then you come from a sort of rustic farming area, or that you are working class. Again, this is not the case. There are accents that belong to lots of different kinds of classes and areas. Also, there's an assumption that they are old forms that are dying out. And if you look at the sort of maps that we looked at before, you might assume that. You might say, well, nobody's using the R anymore in arm in England, therefore it's something which is dying out, it's going out, and those areas that are still using it won't be using it in the time to come. That's possible, but there are also new varieties which are being developed. So it's not necessarily the case that an accent is an old thing. And I'll give you an example of a new variety shortly. I hope the sound is working when I try to play this file shortly. Also, there's a kind of assumption that they're not codified, and this means they don't have observable rules. This is, again, not true. A lot of research has been done to codify and to show what the observable rules are in different accents and different varieties of English, whether we're looking at around the world or whether we're looking specifically at English varieties. So, one question, who has an accent? Occasionally, when I'm looking at things on Twitter, for example, there are adverts or things that people have posted where it says they're looking for somebody with no accent. Everybody who speaks has an accent. If you speak a language, you have an accent in that language. I wonder actually if the same could be true about sign languages. I wonder if you have accents in those. You certainly have different varieties of sign languages, but I'd be interested to hear about that. And I think you've got a talk coming up about that too. Okay, so I've looked at accents and tribalism and accent prejudice. I'm going to move on to another area that I've been involved in, and that's your voice can give you away. So this is looking at forensic speaker comparison and forensic speech science. I'm just going to look at this very, very briefly, just to give you some ideas about what's going on when we're doing this. So sometimes we use the way a person speaks to catch criminals. Now, we can't just do that from the way a person speaks. Forensic evidence looks at a number of different sorts of things when it's putting together a pattern of who a criminal might be and trying to identify them. And one of the things that's used is fingerprints. Fingerprints, and here's an example of one, are specific to a particular person, and there is analysis which can match a fingerprint that's left at a crime scene with another fingerprint that's on a police record, and it can make an identical match. this is not the way that forensic speaker comparison works or forensic speech science works. It's not possible to make an absolute dead-on match. Now, you sometimes see this in the movies. It's certainly in the movie The Fugitive, where they have Richard Kimball speaking here, and then they've got a recording of him there, and they match it perfectly. That doesn't happen. It's very, very unlikely to happen. And if it does happen, it's suspicious. That's another thing to be thinking about here. So this is an example of me saying the word bumblebee. What we can see here is the waveform. We can only see the waveform, and we can see some annotations. So let's hope this works. I'll turn the sound up as much as I can. I'm hoping to be interrupted if it doesn't work, so let's go.
Bumblebee, bumblebee, bumblebee.
Okay, so you should be able to hear me saying bumblebee, bumblebee, bumblebee in that. Now we're looking, as I said, at the waveform, and you can see that I've labelled each of the three words here, and then I've labelled the individual segments in my production of that word. If we look at the three examples of me saying this, listening to it, it sounds very, very similar. Let's hear it again.
Bumblebee, bumblebee, bumblebee.
Okay, it sounds like the same person saying the same word over and over again. But just looking at this, you can see that there are a number of differences. You can see, for example, that the first syllable in the first word is much louder, that the last syllable in the last variant is much longer. And you can also see that the patterns are not identical. Although they are similar, they're not exactly the same. So this is goes some way to showing you that this is not an exact voice print.
Bumblebee, bumblebee, bumblebee.
Okay, let's stop me saying bumblebee, I hope, and move on to the next slide. All right, so what I'm going to do is show you expanded clips of these three vowels, which is the first vowel in the first syllable of bumblebee. So it's basically the sound in the first syllable of bumblebee. So let's go to that slide.
Bumblebee, bumblebee, bumblebee.
Thank you very much. Okay, here we are. Right, so this is the same vowel repeated 3 times by me in context, so it's surrounded by similar sounds. And looking at this, you can see that there are obvious differences. The last one, for example, is much quieter than the first one. But we can also see that there are similarities. So we can see that there's a similar pattern of highs and lows in the production of this vowel. We can see that this pattern repeats. Now, when I said that if something was identical, it would be suspicious, that would be because somebody would have had to splice in some identical material from somewhere else in a recording in order for it to look the same. So when we're doing forensic speaker comparison, forensic speaker analysis, if we see any passages where it's identical, this is just not possible. So for example, if we had a recording from, I don't know, an online banking service or a telephone banking service where the speaker said, is it okay for me to move this money from here to there? And the person said yes. And then they said, can I move that from there as well? And the person said no, and they still moved the money. And then the recording showed that the person said yes both times. Then we could look at those yeses and say, this is identical, that's been spliced in. So we're able to look at the evidence and tell you whether or not it's suspicious. And we're looking at a variety of different things. We're also listening. So if you are doing forensic speaker comparison, you need to bring to bear your auditory phonetic knowledge and also your ability to do acoustic analysis, looking at the sort of things that I've just shown you. Something else that I was involved in couple of years ago was actually for the media. I was asked whether somebody could be a British speaker. And this was a person that the media had got very, very interested in, and they were speaking in a British accent, but you couldn't see their face. So the media interviewed me and a number of other phoneticians and asked them what their opinion was about this speaker. And we did something called speaker profiling. So from the point of view of profiling this speaker, when I was identifying this person who was a terrorist for the media, I was asked a number of different sorts of things about the way that this person spoke and whether or not this could be a British accent. So to start with, the accent I identified that the person was using was something called Multicultural London English. Now I'll play you a clip shortly. Fingers crossed all the settings have stayed the same from earlier. I'll play you a clip shortly. And you can hear Multicultural London English and what it sounds like in comparison to Cockney, which is the traditional, if you like, accent of London. So this is associated with the North East London area. It's associated with Hackney, and later on I'll play you another speaker who is from Hackney, and you can hear he's also got Multicultural London English, but I won't tell you who that is just yet. Also, just from listening to the way that he was speaking, it was obvious that this person was educated, probably to university level, the kind of words that the person was using and so on. So we're not just listening for their voice, we're also listening for other kinds of things. The other thing that I was asked was whether I thought this speaker could be a bilingual speaker or a learner of English. And I deduced, for listening from this person, that if they were a bilingual, they were an early bilingual. And the reason for that is because I felt that if English was learned as a second language, that happened between the ages of 5 and 12. So it happened during the time that people are learning languages by acquisition, basically, rather than consciously learning a language. So it didn't sound to me like the person was a speaker of English as a second language who had been older than maybe about 12 or so when they entered the UK, if they were an immigrant. So from that, I deduced that they were not a recent immigrant. Now, these facts, they were just my hypotheses. Actually, when the person was finally identified, all of these things were true. And a number of us, as I said, have been asked by the media about this and came to the same kind of conclusions. But looking at this, you could see it could apply to a number of people. So this isn't the only kind of analysis that needs to be done on this speaker. If they're interested in the speaker and where they come from, this kind of background information might be useful. But to actually identify whether a person is a speaker that they think committed a crime and so on, then they would have to have a reference recording, which is where they know the person speaking into a microphone, and then compare it with the recordings that were made during the terrorist incident so that they could compare that speech and say it's likely that this person is that person based on their speech features. Now, that word is important, likely. We cannot, as I was saying, not like a fingerprint, we cannot categorically state that it is the same speaker if we're doing forensic speaker comparison. We can only say on a number of parameters there are similarities that lead us to believe it is likely that it could be the same speaker, but we can't be any firmer than that, really. We can usually count people out if we think it's not the same speaker, but we will never be able to say categorically that it's the same person because the data will always vary. Okay. Right, now I mentioned Multicultural London English. As I say, we were playing about with the settings earlier, so I hope I've got this right. I'm hoping somebody will interrupt me if it's not working and you can't hear it. So this is from the One Show, and it's a little exposition about the difference between Cockney and Multicultural London English.
Okay, now Alistair McGowan has been on a road trip of his own, looking at different accents from all around the UK.
On his latest journey, he goes in search of Cockney, but didn't find it where you might expect him to.
The East End of London is home to an accent that's famous all over the world.
The East End has given us film stars like Michael Caine, soap stars like Dot Cotton, footballers like David Beckham, style icons like David Beckham, underwear models like David Beckham.
But the Cockney accent is now under threat from a new kid on the block. Accent expert David Hornsby knows all about it.
So David, here we are in the heart of the Cockney East End of London, but we're not going to be hearing that much Cockney today, are we? Is that right?
No, we're going to be hearing the new accent of the East End. It's called MLE, or Multicultural London English.
No, you're telling me porky pies.
No, straight up.
Straight up? Right, we better scarper.
MLE is the voice of young London.
Visually from Stratford, and I've been Hackney for about 11 years now.
When I was little, because I never used to go out, I used to talk quite Cockney like my mum and dad. And then when I started going out and like mixing with other people, and then I have that youth dialogue that they say now.
Listening to the way that you're talking, it's like, I know it's because it's casual and you're relaxed and you're a cool dude and that, but it's like it's going through the back of the mouth.
How we speak now, it's just more relaxed.
That was an interesting sound as well, the way you speak now. It's very different from nah.
Yeah.
MLE is spoken by people from all ethnic backgrounds, and its influences are also multicultural. It's a mix of sounds from places as diverse as the Caribbean, Greece, Asia and Africa.
One difference I'm hearing is that I would have expected like the epiemmers, like West Ham, for there not to be H's.
No,
but
H dropping's on its way out.
Hackney, you said you're from Hackney.
Yes.
H's are back.
Yeah.
Let's celebrate the H. H's are back, everybody.
The speed of MLE's progress is astonishing. Charlie speaks MLE, but his mum is Cockney through and through.
How, for instance, would you say something like, they all have a different style of talking, don't they?
They all have a different style of talking, don't they?
Charlie?
They've all got a different style of talking, innit?
They don't finish the words when they're talking. So you have to try and pick up what they're saying, and that's what I feel we have to do nowadays.
The fact that it's changed so much within one generation is quite extraordinary and almost alarming, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't say alarming, I'd say it's exciting.
What really surprises me, though, is that the shape of the mouth to produce that accent has changed so much. The whole thing has gone from the front of the mouth, like when Debbie talks, to the back of the mouth when Charlie talks, and that is quite extraordinary, isn't it?
A lot of Cockney vowels are diphthonged. The tongue has to go on a little journey, whereas multicultural London English vowels are much more likely to be monophthonged, so you keep your tongue still. So play becomes blee. I can hear when Debbie's talking, there's a lot more movement of the mouth than like when Charlie talks, and when the girls are talking, it's all that thing that goes out the back, innit?
Okay, so that's multicultural London English in comparison with Cockney. And as they say, there's a change within one generation. This is a social change. People want to sound like they belong to specific kind of social groups. And in this case, we've got people coming together from all over London, young people, let's say, who want to identify with each other, who want to show that they're part of that social group. And so we get this mixing, this new dialect being formed. And yes, it is really exciting. It's fascinating. It's telling us so much about societies, how societies work, and you know, the fact that, quite frankly, who wants to sound like their parents? That's another story. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to men and women's voices. There was some research done on whether men could make their voices sound sexy, and this was research by Susan Hughes and colleagues in 2014, and this really captured my imagination. So what they did was they took 20 men and 20 women, and they asked them to count from 1 to 10, so nice neutral language. And they told them to do this in a number of ways. So first of all, to do it in their normal voice, then to do it in a dominant sounding voice, then in a confident sounding voice, then an intelligent voice, and then a sexy voice or an attractive voice. So the sort of voice you might use if you were trying to attract a mate, if you're on a date, you're trying to persuade somebody to see you again. Okay, they took 20 male and 20 female heterosexual listeners to rate the speakers. And what they found was that when these listeners rated the speakers, all of the speakers improved in making themselves sound more dominant. They also improved in making themselves sound more confident. They improved in making themselves sound more intelligent, but only women improved in making themselves sound more attractive with their voice in the way that they counted from 1 to 10. Interesting. Why is that? Well, Hughes and colleagues put this down to evolutionary reasons. So they basically said that if you are a woman looking for a mate, you're looking for somebody who can be dominant and confident, go out, hunter-gatherers, this sort of thing, be strong, be good examples of fit human beings for procreation, for having children with, whereas men are looking for women who are attractive, again, physically nice, so that you'll get beautiful babies, one assumes, and also nurturing, loving, somebody who's going to look after the family. So there are different sorts of reasons. This was Hugh's suggestion about why we find this. And the fact is that it's still happening now. It's not something that has ceased to be the case. Now, I'm going to play you some voices, some clips with voices in that have people that I've been told are sexy sounding. The first clip is from a talk show, and we have 3 ladies over here, and I want you to listen to this lady in the middle. This is Joanna Lumley. Let's see if this is going to work.
In my head, you know, absolutely fabulous. It's just something, you know, but it's just a current show. But it's been in our lives for 24 years.
Yep.
Which is nuts.
1990 was the first. 26.
26 years.
26 years.
Wow. And Joanna, you were saying when you first got cast and you were like the chemistry, you didn't feel it.
Look, I was really I'd known about, everybody knew about French and Saunders. Everybody knew about that. And I'd been sent this unbelievably funny script. And I was longing to do it. I couldn't believe it. I laughed out loud, Rebel. You know when you open something, you laugh out loud, you go, oh,
and it's very rare.
Very rare
Most
indeed.
of the time you read the script, you're like, oh.
Okay, so Joanna Lumley, the lady in the middle, is known in England, in Britain, for having a sexy sounding voice. So how is the voice sexy? What Hughes and colleagues found is that women tended to make their voice sound much more breathy, which is like this, and also they would lower the pitch so that we're down here. And this is a very soothing kind of sounding voice. We also see it turning up on food advertisements in the UK. There's a supermarket chain that advertises their food by saying this isn't just food, this is M&S food. And if you're looking at chocolate puddings, for example, you can practically hear the chocolate dripping out of the pudding in the voice. It's a sexy kind of sounding thing. So Joanna Lumley is an example of that, and if we compared her with the other 2 speakers, I'm not going to, it might automatically play again, and I'm not intending to play it again, then you can hear that her voice is actually quite different. Okay, now the next clip, this is 2 gentlemen who I'm told have sexy voices. I'll leave you to make a decision.
In my head,
that. Let's go on to the next slide, please. No, let's go on to the next slide. Here we go. Right, so here we are. This is Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey.
I'm Idris Elba.
Matthew McConaughey.
And we're doing the autocomplete, the Wired autocomplete.
Wired autocomplete interview.
Well, basically what it is, or you know what it is. Ta-da!
Where is Idris Elba right now?
Idris Elba right now is in New York.
Where is Idris Elba from?
London, East London. I'm a Hackney boy.
Born?
Born. But I actually was born in Forest Gate Hospital.
Where is Idris Elba? Jing.
What? Where is Idris Elba DJing?
Where are you Jing, man?
I mean, you know what, Jing?
Better Jing.
Yesterday, I was DJing in Derbyshire.
Wait, where is this?
In Derbyshire, England.
Where did you go to school?
I went to Barking College of Technology to study drama.
Matthew McConaughey, that is I.
Where was Matthew McConaughey born?
Uvalde, Texas. We moved out when the first Wendy's moved in.
Okay, so these, I'm told, are men who have quite sexy sounding voices, and the pitch is quite low with them. They're actually speaking quite slowly as well. They sound very confident. They sound like ideal sort of mates if you're in the running for that, and if you think that these are sexy men. But they're not doing it in the same way that women are changing their voices to sound sexy. So they're sexy men and they sound sexy, but they're not changing their voice to sound sexy. That's kind of the key here.
I'm Idris Elba.
Right. Stop getting that to play twice. Okay. So what they found also, what Susan Hughes and colleagues found, was something called competitor derogation. Women rated men's confident voices more confident than normal voices, but men didn't. They actually rated other men's confident voices as less confident. And one question that Hughes and colleagues raise is, are men bioprogrammed to deliberately downplay the confidence of competitors? It's a good question, isn't it? I think I'm going to leave that one there. Okay, something else that I've looked at in this sort of area of gender and voice is transgender voice. If somebody is transitioning from female to male, this has a different effect on the voice from if they're transitioning from male to female. So if you're transitioning from female to male, then you're given testosterone, which generally causes the body to go through male puberty. And one of the effects of that is that your larynx gets larger. This means that when you push air through it, the vocal folds will vibrate more slowly, which means that your pitch drops, basically. So it has an effect on the voice. And here's a video from a transgender man, Ryan Jacob Flores, who made a video about how things had changed for him over the 6 months, the first 6 months that he was taking testosterone. And this is just the clip about his speaking voice. And you can hear the pitch changes very much from the first month to the 6th month.
My name is Ryan Flores, and this is my voice 1 month on T. My name is Ryan Flores, and this is my voice 2 months on T.
My name is Ryan Flores, and this is my voice 3 months on T. My name is Ryan Flores, and this is my voice 4 months on T. My name is Ryan Flores, and this is my voice 5 months on T. Which brings me to today. My name is Ryan Flores, and this is my voice 6 months on T.
I actually find that piece of video really, really moving. I think it's just extraordinary the way that this person's voice has changed. And in the research that has looked at female to male speakers, they've found that actually it happens quite naturally. They don't have to worry too much about it. There is some concern, some anxiety when they start to speak about how they'll be perceived. But as they take the testosterone and as it has the effect on the voice and the voice changes, they find that they are usually not misgendered. If they're on the telephone, for example, it's assumed because the pitch is low that they are male speakers. And this is something that I found in the research that I did, actually with one of my colleagues, Rodney Jones, and one of my students, Iona Jacobs. And we looked at this, and we gave people sample recordings of transgender speakers, and we asked them to say which ones, what gender they thought various people were. And pitch was the thing that made a lot of difference. So if the pitch range was low, then somebody was thought to be a male speaker.
My name is Ryan Flores, and
okay, I need to press the return button. I think that's what I'm doing that's wrong there. So male to female transition in adulthood is clearly going to be problematic for the voice, because if you are an adult male, you've already gone through these physical changes. So the vocal changes in the vocal apparatus have already happened unless puberty blockers have been prescribed. So unless this was identified early enough and there was agreement from your parents that you could take something which would stop you going through puberty while you were kind of sorting this whole situation out about what was going to happen. Now, it's not impossible to change your voice, and I've seen some extraordinary examples of speech therapy helping transgender female speakers to really modify their voice so that they have a much higher pitch and they sound different, but it is a major, major challenge. So, as I say, specialist speech therapy can help this, but it's not available to everybody and it can be a bit of a challenge. This is my friend Sophie. This is actually at Reading Pride. She runs one of the sound stages at Reading Pride, and I interviewed her about her voice and about how the way that she speaks affects her as a transgender woman. And she basically said the voice gives everything away. It's got a much bigger role than it should have. So she identified that when she speaks, she finds that there are often issues. And she talked about misgendering, the fact that people identify her as male purely because of her voice. She said sometimes this is deliberate. People do it deliberately in order to be hurtful. And sometimes it's non-deliberate. People are hearing her speaking and they're expecting man and they turn around and they're surprised. And again, this is largely due to do with the pitch of the voice and nothing really else. both of these things she finds to be extremely upsetting, whether it's deliberate or non-deliberate. And if it is non-deliberate, people very, very often apologize to her. But she said it's still something that's very upsetting, because it's showing her that the way that she's speaking is not allowing her to reflect herself as a female speaker. Now, she does have strategies for this. For example, she does put on a very breathy voice. And something else that she does is, if she's answering the telephone, she always says, "Hello, this is Sophie," when she answers the phone immediately, so that people hear a female voice and that they identify the person as being a female speaker. Okay, now I'm just going to say something about considerations for English language teaching in an international context, in case anyone's interested in that and how this sort of stuff fits into what's going on. And mainly what I'm talking about here is prejudice, is the way that somebody speaks causes there to be prejudice against them for some reason, misunderstandings and so on. And as I say, it might be deliberate, it might not be deliberate, it might be unconscious bias. So for English language teachers, if you are an English language teacher, then what I would suggest is do your best to prevent the unintentional spread of learned prejudices. Something that we often find in English language teaching materials is that we have a particular sort of model going on. It might be something called General American, it might be something called RP, it could be another variety of English. But we find that we expose our learners to this, and then they're not used to other varieties, but also that some prejudices may go with them. So my recommendation would be to expose learners to a variety of voices, not just to prestige accents, so that they can get used to them, so that therefore they are not unfamiliar, and that they don't then develop biases of their own, which may be based on an English language teacher's own biases, particularly if they are somebody from that region. So if you are a British English or English speaker, you may have accent biases, prejudices that you bring with you to the classroom. Same for American English speakers or speakers of other varieties that are similar. Also, make sure that you are equipping your learners with the tools to listen analytically. So do listening work with them, give them examples, enable them to do comprehension tests where they're listening to different kinds of things and where they're able to pick up differences and be able to work out what's going on. And a blatant plug is, do come on the UCL summer course in English phonetics. Sadly, we're not running it this year. It's in August every year, usually. This year, because of coronavirus, it's been suspended. But do come if you'd like to. It's 2 weeks in August, just phonetics. Fantastic. I love it. I usually teach on it and it's great fun. Okay, so just finally, I'm going to say something about writing a popular science book. This book that has the topics in that I've covered in this talk, and it has more topics than this. This is just a sample of the things that I've talked about to do with the voice and to do with the way that people are perceived or the way that they use their voices. This book is something that I have always wanted to write. So it really is the book I've always wanted to write. People say there's one book in everybody. If this is my only book, well, if it's my only popular science book, I think it's a pretty good one. I have, of course, written other books, contributed to other books, but this was the one I wanted to have out there so that people really understand phonetics, speech, how it works, get the opportunity to think about it. But it does have a very British bias, except for the last chapter, which looks more at accents and attitudes to people from different English-speaking backgrounds. So first of all, where did this start? Well, it started with my mum and dad. Here they are on the beach. This is the late 1950s. My dad and mum had me very, very late on. My mum was 38 and my dad was 57, so they were quite old at that sort of point of life. But something that my dad had gone through was he was actually born in London. He was born in South London to a family of 9. He was the middle one of 9, and he started off working as a barrow boy in Covent Garden Market. So that's where he worked. And he would have had a very London sounding accent, a Cockney sounding accent, although strictly speaking, he reckons he could hear Bow Bells, which is when you're considered to be a Cockney speaker. But I'm wondering if that's true. Anyway, he had a very London sounding accent. And he changed that because he wanted to work in a bank. So he noticed that if he had that accent, it wasn't going to happen for him. He had to change the way that he spoke, and he clearly listened very analytically, and he passed this on to me because he would pick me up every single time I said something that was what he considered not to be suitable. If it wasn't well spoken, then he would take me to task over it. And so I started listening to what was going on and how people were speaking, and that's what got me interested in it. Now, for my mum also came from a very, very working class background, but something that she gave me was a love of musicals. And of course, this is the big musical if you're a phonetician. There are not an awful lot of things around where you can find phoneticians turning up, but here is one, Henry Higgins, an appalling male chauvinist pig, but he figured in this. And I think I really took something away. In a way, it was my dad's story, going from a flower girl selling flowers at Covent Garden Market to saying that she's going to do something else. In fact, Higgins says she could get a job in a shop. And in this scene here, where she's dressed in this wonderful pink confection of a dress, she's actually living at Higgins's mother. She's moved out. And he says to her, well, what are you going to do without me? And she says, I'll teach phonetics. And I think that stuck because that's what I ended up doing. So influences in my life come from my dad, my environment, listening, thinking about language, understanding about language, and being really interested in speech, and also from this movie. Thank you, Audrey Hepburn, and thank you to my mum for being such a fan of it. Something else that I had on my side was a number of advocates, let's say. This is a group of people at last year's summer course in English phonetics. And we can see here in the orange shirt, this is Professor John Wells. And we have Dr. Michael Ashby, who's been, both of these have been the director of the summer course. This is Dr. Jeff Lindsay, who's currently directing it. This is me in a very flowery dress. And then right over here, we've got David Crystal. And it was actually a conversation with David Crystal where he said, well, why don't you write a book? And so I did. So all I have to say now is thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope it's given you some ideas thinking about speech, about what it contributes to our knowledge of people, of language generally, and also just be careful. Don't take it for granted that you know somebody from the way that they're speaking, because chances are there's more to it than that, and you should take that into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Setter, for this fascinating talk. We have a bunch of questions right now.
Should I stop sharing my screen, or have you done it for me?
Actually, I think whenever you talk, your screen is going to be showing, right? So,
okay, shall I? I'll come out, shall I?
Oh, no, it's okay. I'm going to be asking you some questions. Yeah.
Yes, that's fine. Yes.
Yeah. So we have some questions first by Eric Ozo, and his question is on lexical representations, right? So he would like to ask about those situations when a speaker changes his or her pronunciation of a word under social or contextual pressure. Okay. Does this imply the lexical phonological representation was altered, or what do you think a new representation was created and connected together with the former representation of the same lexical entry?
I have to say, this is absolutely not my field at all. I don't work in this area, so it's very difficult for me to say, yes, it's that, or no, it's something else. I think people are aware, certainly in Britain, they're aware of different pronunciations. And if they hear somebody speaking in a different way and they feel that they want to be part of that social group for whatever reason, then they may well change. But for me, it's got more to do with identity of the speaker. If the speaker has a very strong personal identity, then you find that they don't change very much. Whereas if a speaker is more accommodating, perhaps, or feels that they want to move into a different social group or something like that, or is just the sort of person that's a bit of a social chameleon, then you find that they're more likely to change. But I mean, I had a colleague who was British, who worked in the United States for most of his life and never picked up a trace of a US accent at all. So I'd say that was a very robust kind of identity, but I wouldn't for a minute think that he wasn't aware of all the different ways of pronouncing things. I'm sorry, that's the best answer I can give. I hope that's okay.
All right, that's okay. There's another question here. Could the power dynamics between genders still present today, that's still found today, be rooted in the pitch difference?
Could it be rooted in the pitch difference? I don't know. I mean, it's a kind of, the thing is that this is all wrapped up with society and how society is developed and the way that society has gone. So if people have been elevated in a particular society and they speak in a particular way, then that is going to have a bearing on people who speak in a different way are perceived. So I don't know whether it's rooted in that exactly, but it's going to be to do with the way that societies work. I mean, for example, Margaret Thatcher, which is something I mention in my book, quite famously had speech lessons because when she was originally speaking in Parliament, I think she was the education minister to start with, if you get quite excited, anybody gets quite excited about something, they tend to push more air out, and so your pitch range goes up and suddenly you're kind of speaking up here like this, and it can be quite difficult for people if you're speaking like that for a long period of time. So something that she did or was trained to do was to slow down and also to speak with a much lower pitch range. And to some extent, she's a little bit on the breathy side as well. She's breathy sounding. So she changed that in order to, if you like, sound more powerful. So from that point of view, I think you could say that the pitch dynamic does interact with the power dynamic to some extent. I don't think you can say it doesn't, but it's going to be based on how societies use language and whether this is important and what kind of features it's showing you, I think.
Okay, all right. There's another question by Felipe Kupski. Compared to monolinguals, less is known about how bilinguals encode identity through the use of their second language. Out of curiosity, in your experience and in your perception, are immigrants in England trying to accommodate their second language speech to many particular different English varieties? Or are they trying to accommodate that to the RP, to the MLA? What would be governing, this L2 use or choice, if there is some?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is very complex, and it's going to be down to the individual to some extent. So there are people who come into any country as migrants who are just interested in working, sending money home, and then going home. So those sorts of people don't tend to try to integrate with a particular group that they're in. And so we may find that either if they've learned a standard type accent, they're either more likely to stick with that, or they're more likely just to use their L1 influenced English pronunciation. If they're actually in a particular sort of society where they want to integrate more, then what you tend to find again is that people accommodate more, so they pick up the speech features of the people surrounding them, depending on what it is they want to do at a particular time. So it's going to be very much dependent on the individual, what the individual's motivations are. If the individual is in a family group, then that might have a bearing on them. But it's very complex. It's not just going to be down to one thing or down to another thing. And identity is something that's going to play a role in this. So if people feel that they have a very kind of strong identity, I mean, even they might not realize this, then they're not going to change the way that they speak very much. But if they're very strongly motivated to change for any particular reason, then they will change that. And I've seen some extraordinary changes where people, it's almost impossible to work out that somebody is an L2 speaker of English, and it's not because they've been in the UK, for example, since a child, or exposed to a variety like that since they were a child, but actually because they've listened analytically and worked really, really hard. And for other people, it's just not something it's not something that matters to them, so they're not really bothering with it to the same kind of extent, because it's not something that is important for them as a person. So again, very, very complex issue.
All right, thank you. There's another one. is it possible that the multicultural accent, which is growing in London, for example, could help to diminish linguistic prejudice?
I'd like to think so, but at the moment that doesn't seem to be the case. We've had quite a few headline-grabbing things in Britain where people have said that multicultural London English or other multicultural urban Englishes like Manchester, for example, that these are actually ruining the English language and that it's evidence of immigration and this sort of thing. So we've actually seen quite a lot of prejudices, largely pushed by the press, to be honest, I think. So I think it's still quite a young accent. It's been around, I think it was identified kind of in the 1980s, but it's something that has been gaining a lot of speakers, certainly, and so I'd like to think that at some point it could be a leveler, but I don't think we'll ever really know. And to be honest, with the way that we've got the British press, I mean, like the Sun newspaper, for example, there's nothing that they're going to say that's good about any hint of immigrants. So, and if people are reading those sorts of things, they're going to be influenced by it. And we've seen other accents. I mean, things like estuary English, if you like, that was the sort of predecessor in London to multicultural London English, although they're very different sorts of things. But estuary English it's a kind of mixture of Cockney and popular London, and it has some features that you can identify from a range of speakers around the Thames estuary, basically. So it extends up to certainly up to Reading, and down to the opening of the Thames into the estuary. So we speakers around there have these sorts of features, and again it got all sorts of really, really negative press. So people saying that people that speak like that should have their mouths stuffed with glass and things like that. So accent is a majorly hot topic in Britain, and I don't think these prejudices are ever going to go away, but they might change depending on the number of speakers that have them. I mean, this is kind of going in a different direction, but something else that we find is that a lot of speakers in the UK are adopting something called uptalk, where the intonation goes up at the end of a sentence, and a lot of people find this very annoying. Because it's a pattern that's, I mean, it's not that new, but it's a relatively recent pattern, documented by Paul Warren in his book. I mean, I'm doing it a bit now, but what we find is that speakers find it very annoying, and actually there's been studies that have shown that employers don't like it. So if you've got somebody who's equally as well qualified for a job A and B, and this one's doing uptalk and that one isn't doing it, they're more likely to give the job to the person that doesn't do it. However, this is so prevalent that in 50 years' time, everybody's going to be using uptalk. So maybe at that point, it won't matter anymore. But at the minute, people hate it.
All right. Well, there's a question about forensic phonetics. For example, are there acoustic cues, or if there are, which cues would you look at in order to determine whether someone learned English no later than age 12 or something like that?
Well, I mean, you'd have to have somebody from the right sort of background who could make these kind of comments about a speaker. So you'd need to have somebody who understood second language phonological acquisition, for example, to be able to take part in the analysis and say what the features are. Now, the features are going to vary depending on what the first language is of the second language English speaker. They're going to be different. So you'd have to have a good knowledge of what those features were likely to be. And you'd need to be able to, I mean, we don't just do acoustic analysis on speech, we do auditory analysis, and the acoustic analysis is something that helps us to support our findings. And sometimes we might find some very some stuff that turns up in the signal that you can't easily hear. But we'd need somebody who had those sorts of skills in order to do that kind of analysis. And the cues are going to be dependent. They are dependent on every individual speaker. Every speaker is different, whether they're an L1 or an L2 speaker of a language. So we'd be looking for things that were very particular to that speaker, and some general measures as well we'd take, but we're looking at things which are particular to a speaker, so that we can say this speaker's doing this, we see the same kind of thing happening in this file, therefore the likelihood that A and B are similar is possible, whereas A and C, where C is not doing that kind of thing at all, we can rule that person out. So it would depend very much on the speaker, on the features that we were looking for, and to be able to say whether somebody was likely to be somebody who'd learned a language after a certain age, then we'd need somebody who is an L2 phonology specialist to be able to make those sorts of comments.
All right. Final question. Well, you have carried out research on transgender voice. Have you conducted research on queer English, or do you know anything about people who are not transgender, but they're gay? And I mean, if there is the same process, definitely not, but do you have something to say about that?
I haven't, and I'm never keen to comment on things that I haven't done any research on, but there is certainly research out there that shows that people who are homosexual have different sorts of speech features. But again, it's going to be a massive continuum. So there'll be people who could not be identified from the way that they're speaking as being a homosexual speaker, and people who actually sound quite homosexual but aren't. So it's a big field to look at, but there's certainly research that's been done that's looked at the phonetics of female speakers, lesbians, where they were looking at if there were differences between the vowels, for example, and they found that there were some differences in some vowels. So yes, the research is out there, but no, it's not something that I have done. And I think the message basically from what I'm trying to say is that you cannot assume anything about a person just from the way that they speak, and you shouldn't. You should, listen to their voice, enjoy it, but then draw your conclusions from what you know about them, rather than drawing them just from the way that they speak, because that's the problem that we've got. People hear you speak and they put you in a pigeonhole, and this is something that we really need to find a way to combat, in my opinion.
Right, thank you very much. So I would also like to thank the audience for being with us and for participating in the discussions, right? And once again, I would like to thank you, Professor Jane Setter, for your great and illuminating talk. It was very, very nice. Would you like to say something before we end the transmission?
Yes, I'd like to again thank Abralin and the LAGB for involving me in this. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Alvis, for taking the questions. Yeah, I'm just absolutely delighted to be here. I hope the audience has enjoyed it. I'd also like to thank the audience very much, and wish you a hopefully not continued situation, let's put it that way, when we can all get back to normal. But it's actually good having these opportunities to